What? I'm your host, Tom Kearns, and welcome to the Anglo-Saxon England podcast, episode 30, King Ine the Lawmaker. Of all the kings of Wessex, prior to the reign of King Alfred, Ine is the one with probably the greatest reputation. This rests mostly on the respect afforded to his law code by King Alfred in the preface to his own collection of legal rulings. There, Alfred explicitly sets himself in a tradition following from Moses and Ine in making laws for his people. This is high praise, and surely must attract the interest of readers. Who was this Ine? Why are his laws so notable? And does the reality live up to the expectations set by Alfred's praise? In this episode, we will seek to answer these questions and discover that Ine's legacy is decidedly more complicated than a surface reading of Alfred's preface would suggest. King Ine ruled in Wessex from 689 to 726. He claimed descent from Ceolin through Cynegils. He was the son of a West Saxon nobleman named Kenred, and seems to have come from a line of men who were members of the royal dynasty, but who were never themselves king, at least not before Ine. Instead, his grandfather, Ceolwald, was the brother of King Cynegils, and of course, through Cynegils he was related back, ultimately to Serdej. We don't know much about how Ine became king. Bede says very little about Ine on the whole, and the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle doesn't record any details about his rise to the kingship. We must then speculate a little from what Ine did as king. His reign was characterised by a keen interest in order, and from this we can suggest that perhaps in the wake of Cadwallader's military adventurism and sudden abdication, Wessex was left in an unstable position. As king, Ine was keen to try and steady the ship. To this end, Ine promulgated the first law code to survive from among the West Saxons. Indeed, it's the only West Saxon law code to survive from before the reign of King Alfred. In the preface to his law code, Ine says that he had been consulting with the chief men of his kingdom about how to ensure the salvation of their souls and security of the kingdom. To that end, he promulgated his laws so that order would be established and so that none of his ealdormen or subjects would pervert his will. It seems then that Ine was keen to use his laws as a means to bring order and uniformity to Wessex, particularly by binding his ealdormen to his will, a detail which may lend credence to the notion that he feared their ability to create internal instability. We are able to date the law code to fairly early in Ine's reign. In the preface, he lists 3 men who advised him in its creation: his father Kenred, Hadi the Bishop of Winchester, and Eorkenwald, Bishop of Worcester. Bede tells us that Eorkenwald died in 694, so the laws must have been created before that date. This places the legislative meeting of the Witan in the first 5 years of Ine's reign, confirming the suspicion that the need for order was a primary concern of Ine's upon taking the throne. Before getting into the laws themselves, it would be remiss of me not to talk a bit more about Alfred's treatment of them, and specifically the question his treatment raises over whether we have Ine's laws in their entirety. The only copy we have is a part of the preface to King Alfred's laws issued in the late 9th century. In his preface, Alfred explicitly says that he removed early laws which he didn't agree with, leaving open the question of what is missing from Ine's laws. Unless we're able to find another independent version of Ine's laws anywhere, we will never know if anything is missing. Despite this caveat though, Ine's laws are still extremely important, and offer a glimpse not only into Ine's aims as a king, but also into the society of Wessex in the late 7th and early 8th century. The first laws found in the code make it very clear that Wessex was still not fully Christianized by the 690s. Some of the earliest parts of the law code, for example, mandate that a baby is to be baptized within 30 days of birth, with a fine of 30 shillings if these 30 days elapse, and a fine of everything the guilty party possesses if a baby dies unbaptized. The laws also mandate that a slave ordered by his master to work on a Sunday is to be freed, and slaves who work on Sundays without their master's knowledge are to be flogged. Besides enforcing such aspects of basic Christian behaviour, the laws also enforce the payment of church dues on Martinmas, as well as establish the principle of sanctuary, in which a person liable for the death penalty or flogging will have the punishment remitted if they're able to reach a church. The laws also establish that a Christian, defined as a communicant, is to have their oath favoured over a non-Christian if a criminal case comes to oath swearing, thus establishing practising Christians as a favoured class in Ine's Wessex. Ine, clearly a Christian himself, is attempting to use his royal authority to further Christianise Wessex, both through harsh punishments for failing to adhere to Christian practices, and through making non-Christians into effectively second-class citizens. We know that Ine was a committed patron of monasteries, and was close friends with both Eochaidh and Huddy. It seems that by his day the ruling house of Wessex was firmly Christian, but to what extent paganism remained a real problem among the West Saxons is debatable. Ine's major concern seems to have been with Wessex having a large population of unbaptized people. His decree that children are to be baptized within 30 days, and the specification that communicants' oaths be preferred over non-communicants, strongly suggests that he was attempting to end the practice exemplified by men like Cadwalla to delay baptism until death approached. Rather than seeing his laws as a sign of continued paganism then, Ine may well represent an attempt to pull Wessex out of the missionary phase of church history and into a more Christianized state. In this, we probably see the influence of Eochaidh and Huddy, who, as bishops, oversaw the pastoral care of the West Saxon people. The strong influence of Huddy in particular over Ine can be seen in the king's tensions with the Archbishop of Canterbury. Huddy's diocese of Winchester was enormous, as was usually the case for missionary churches. Canterbury, still imbued with reforming zeal from the recent archiepiscopacy of Theodore of Tarsus, wanted Ine to break up the Diocese of Winchester so that pastoral care could be more effectively distributed to the people. Ine refused to do so until after Huddy's death in 705, at which point Ine finally divided the lands of Winchester's diocese between Winchester and the bishopric of Sherborne. If the mandates regarding Christian behaviour and baptism do reflect the influence of Eochaidh and Huddy, then it seems that rather than simply refusing to impoverish his friend, Ine delayed to break up Huddy's landholdings because the bishop was overseeing an initiative for greater Christianization which Ine didn't want to endanger. The decrees relating to religion make up only a small part of Ine's laws. By far the greater part of them are concerned with secular affairs, such as the punishments for various crimes and the payment of weregild. From them we can build up some sense of what life was like in Ine's Wessex. The laws show us, for example, that in Ine's day the system of land tenure was quite advanced in Wessex. The laws dealing with wandering cattle make it clear that the West Saxons were practising open field agriculture, in which a lord owned several large fields, which were apportioned out to free men in strips. Ine's laws control the payments due to one freeman if another freeman's cattle wander onto his strip of land and damage it. It seems interesting that the king was either required or possibly took it upon himself to intervene in such disputes, which must have been fairly commonplace, which show that Ine attempted to rule and regulate his kingdom far more directly than had really been evidenced before him. Besides information about agriculture, the laws also legislate that both nobles and freemen were required to serve in the Fyrd, F-Y-R-D, that is to provide military service, if called upon, or face hefty fines if they refused. Another interesting requirement of Ine's laws relates to the oaths sworn in the event of a homicide. If a man was accused of murder, he required oath helpers to swear to his innocence. Ine's laws required at least one of these helpers to be of high rank, that is, to have a high weregild. This strongly suggests that the oath of a noble was valued more highly than the oath of a peasant. It also marks a move away from a strictly kin-based legal system. A man couldn't just rely on his kin, but had to seek support among his social superiors or the clergy, thus suggesting that Wessex under Ine was moving out of a tribal society and into a more hierarchical social structure, Not quite the feudalism that we would see in the later Middle Ages, but some intermediate zone between a tribal society and a feudal society. The laws also make it clear that thievery was a major concern for Ine. His laws litigate that upon leaving a trackway, a person was to shout or blow their horn to announce themselves so that they wouldn't be taken for a thief. This implies that thieves hiding in the woods were a problem. In the spirit of maintaining order, it may not be a coincidence then that it's in Ine's law codes that we find the first reference to shires in Wessex. The shire was ruled over by the ealdorman, who was responsible for seeing that the king's justice was enforced. In origin, the shires probably reflect older tribal divisions and may well have been a hangover from the days of multiple kingship in Wessex. But under Ine, they'd been co-opted to serve the will of the king and ensure that his justice was properly implemented. One last interesting feature of Ine's laws are his attempts to legislate for both the British and the English within his realm. As Wessex expanded westwards into Dumnonia, larger numbers of Britons came to live under West Saxon rule. Ine was apparently so concerned with this that he attempted to define the place that Britons held in West Saxon society. The results are quite discriminatory and put the Britons at a clear disadvantage when dealing with their Saxon neighbours. Specifically, a Briton's weregild meaning literally man price, being the monetary value of a person's life, was half that of an Englishman's. Weregild was also the primary indicator of social rank, as I've said. Thus, the more expensive one's weregild, the more important they were, and as we've seen, the more valuable their legal testimony. Thus, Britons were certainly placed at a social disadvantage under Ine's rule. Materially, it seems that Ine's reign coincided with a time of prosperity for Wessex. We see this particularly in the foundation of Hamwich, modern-day Southampton, as a trading settlement with a population of about 5,000 people, a metropolis by the standards of the time. It had a regular planned layout, suggesting royal planning, and the inhabitants were mostly specialised craftsmen. The presence of imported goods like pottery and whetstone, along with many sheatas, silver coins minted in Frisia, indicates that Hamwich was a trading hub within Ine's kingdom, and probably was created as a West Saxon rival to other wicks like London or Ipswich. It seems then that Ine's reign, at least at its beginning, was one concerned primarily with stability and encouraging prosperity within Wessex. This wouldn't last though, and for all his success within Wessex, Ine's reign was a more mixed time for the West Saxons in terms of international politics, and this would ultimately come to undo Ine. I want to take this opportunity to thank you for listening and say how much I greatly appreciate every single one of you who's listening to this. If you are enjoying it, if you enjoy this show, it would be extremely helpful if you could like, comment, subscribe, leave a rating, preferably 5 stars, or a positive rating on whatever platform it is you use. It really boosts the show in the algorithms that these various platforms use, and it helps to get it exposed to more people. You could also consider supporting us on Patreon, where you'll get various types of bonus content, including bonus episodes, and as of fairly recently, access to transcripts of all the previous episodes, if you want to engage with the show in that way. Speaking of Patreon, I also have some patrons to thank, so sincerely thank you to Claire Hamilton Russell and Cameron Bradley. Your support is extremely appreciated, and I hope you're enjoying the bonus content. Ine struggled to maintain the overlordship of southern England that Cadwalla had created. Upon becoming king, Ine was forced to settle with King Witred of Kent. If you'll recall last episode, Cadwalla had initially invaded Kent and set up his brother Mull as a sub-king there. When Mull was killed in a Kentish revolt, Cadwalla had invaded again and assumed personal rule of the kingdom, after which he imposed heavy tribute in punishment for the death of his brother. Upon Cadwalla's abdication, Kent fell into a period of chaos, in which multiple men contended for the throne. One of these men, Whitred, succeeded in unifying the kingdom again once he became king in 690. It's unclear what happened in the years immediately after becoming king, but the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle says that in 694, Ine and Whitred came to terms over the death of Mull, with Kent paying Wessex compensation. In return, Ine allowed Whitred to remain independent. Whitred also is famous for promulgating his own law code, and an interesting feature of this latter code is the use of the West Saxon term Ysith for a nobleman instead of the Kentish term Eorlacund, which we find in the earlier Kentish law codes. This shift into West Saxon terminology has been interpreted as a sign of cooperation between Ine and Whitred, with the intent of creating a common legal culture, but it could also be seen as a sign of encroaching Saxon influence on the small Jutish kingdom of Kent. D.P. Kirby suggests that the joint issuing of the law codes by Ine and Whitred may be a direct response to the settlement of hostilities between Wessex and Kent in 694. This is speculation and we can't know, neither of them say that that was the case, but it seems interesting that both of these kings issued law codes in fairly quick succession and that there are clear commonalities between them. Besides Kent, other southern kingdoms which had fallen to Cadwalla, such as Surrey and Sussex, were seemingly in dispute during Ine's reign, indicating that he lost control of them also. Sussex for a time was seemingly under Ine's domination, as it was ruled by a man named Nothelm, who's identified in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle as a kinsman of Ine. The two are also recorded as waging war together against the Dumnonians, suggesting that they were indeed in a military alliance of some kind. However, this subjugation of Sussex apparently ended with Nothelm's death around 722, since in that year Ine invaded the South Saxon kingdom in order to subdue it, suggesting that it had gone into revolt. Even when Nothelm was on the throne, though, Sussex and Surrey both seem to have been a source of trouble for Ine, since on several occasions, beginning as early as 704, he had to pressure the kings of the two kingdoms to hand over West Saxon fugitives seeking refuge in the woods that ran along their borders. This also suggests that Ine's plans to regulate West Saxon society were not without their enemies, a fact that would come to seriously undermine his reign in the later years of his life. To the west of Wessex, Ine's reign marked a resurgence of West Saxon expansion into the lands of Dumnonia. King Geraint, the king of Dumnonia, was a frequent target of Ine's conquests, but it is difficult to tell exactly how successful was Ine's advance westwards. In the Anglo-Saxon sources, the implication is that Ine's victory over Geraint in 710 finally saw Devon absorbed into Wessex, and the end of a unified kingdom of Dumnonia, since after this point the Britons to the west ceased to be called the West Welsh, and instead become the Cornish. However, Welsh chronicles, such as the Annales Cambriae, record at least one more victorious battle by the Dumnonians against Wessex in 721 or 722, at a place called Hehill, which is only said to have occurred among the Cornish, but which suggests that Cornish strength was not totally broken with the fall of Geraint. To make things more complicated, in Welsh heroic legend, Geraint quickly became associated with a legendary 5th century hero called Geraint mab Erbyn, a figure associated in some stories with King Arthur. This makes it very difficult to reconstruct the history of Ine's wars in the West, since it is impossible to tell what about Geraint is historical and what is legendary. Something seems to have happened during Ine's reign which permanently changed the nature of British power to the west of Wessex, and this seems to have been associated with the death of Geraint. But other than this, it's difficult to say more. It seems clear, though, that where Ine's relations with the English to his east were not entirely successful, he had much more success dealing with the Britons, and in this he marks a return to the old West Saxon practice of harassing the Britons, which Cadwalla had briefly paused with his turn to the east. Beginning around 721, Ine began to face internal rebellions. In that year, he is said in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle to have killed an atheling, that is a prince, named Cynewulf, probably a distant relation vying for the throne. The next year, his queen Athelberg demolished the earthen fortification built at Taunton, which Ine had built around the year 700. Possibly, this was done in revenge for the killing of Cynewulf, suggesting that he was possibly a kinsman of hers. Immediately after this, another atheling, Ealdbert, presumably in exile, began to move between Surrey and Sussex, raising support for a move against Ine. In response, in 725, Ine invaded Sussex and killed Ealdbert. Why Ine began to face such internal hostility in these later years is unknown, but it's probably got something to do with his centralising tendencies. Usually nobles don't like to have their liberties stepped upon, so it's not hard to imagine that Ine's reign irked some of them. The trouble on the Surrey-Sussex border may also indicate that Ealdbert was encouraged by the growing power of Mercia under Athelbald, or the resurgence of Kentish influence in Sussex and Surrey. Whatever caused the unrest, it resulted in 726 in Ine's abdication, and as Bede says, his choice to leave the kingdom to the younger men. With Athelberg, Ine went on pilgrimage to Rome, where he is traditionally said to have founded the Schola Saxonum, or Saxon School, a resting place for English pilgrims during their time in the city. Upon leaving Wessex, Ine vanishes from history and presumably died in Rome, but we don't know exactly when. The kings who succeeded him lacked the innovative spirit that he had, but that is a story for another time. For now, it's time to reflect on the legacy of Ine. Partly because of Alfred's respect for his law code, Ine has long held a prominent place in the history of Wessex. For his creativity, he's to be commended, and his code certainly provides valuable insight into West Saxon society in the late 7th and early 8th centuries. But beyond his laws, Ine's reign is more mixed. He was unable to maintain the preeminent position in the south won by Cadwalla, and his centralising tendencies seem to have inspired resentment among his people. In the west, he was seemingly more successful, but just how much more is hard to gauge due to the problems of the evidence. Thus, it is difficult to tell how truly successful Ine's legal experiment was. Certainly no other West Saxon kings before Alfred followed him in promulgating law codes, something that sets Wessex apart from Kent, where several kings followed Athelbert in producing laws. This suggests that Ine's legacy didn't inspire future kings in the way that Athelbert's did. Even Alfred, with his comment that he removed laws with which he didn't agree, was not totally enamoured with Ine's legacy. Ine then seems not to quite live up to the expectations set by his link to Alfred the Great, and truthfully it is difficult to say to what extent his time on the throne marked a real revolution in Anglo-Saxon power, and to what extent it was a failed experiment. It didn't leave that much of an impression on the West Saxons, and certainly the setbacks that Wessex faced in international politics suggest that by many conventional measures, Ine's kingship was not in fact a particularly successful one. Thank you for listening. I hope you've enjoyed this episode of the Anglo-Saxon England podcast. Once again, I've been your host, Tom Kearns, and I hope you'll join us for the next episode. Until next time.